Hi there. This is Andre Darmanin from Urban Equity Consulting Services and your host of Global Conversations once again. I'm looking forward to this conversation today regarding activism versus pragmatism in the equity, diversity, and inclusion space. And this is something that has been brought about more recently with the protests or the the conversations surrounding anti-wokeness and whatnot. But how does it relate to workplace conversations? How do we get around that? How do we accommodate those conversations? Do equity practitioners need to be activists or pragmatists, or can they be both? And these are the kinds of questions I'd like to have today. So today I have Rachel Decoste. I've known Rachel for a number of years. We're both public administration graduates in different schools, mind you. We're both, I don't want to say former or present public sector workers, but we've both been in the public sector in different capacities. And, I'm honored to have Rachel as a guest. So welcome, Rachel. Thanks for being here today.
Thanks for having me. I'm so happy to be here.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. So today, like I said, we're going to have that conversation around differentiating, or do we need to differentiate between, equity, inclusion, activism versus pragmatism, or can they be both? And, in the time I've known you, you've been on both sides of the fence, given your work, right? So, let's start off first by just introducing the audience of who you are. If people don't know who you are, I can tell you right now, you have a long resume of work and activism and media experience, etc. So, you know what? I'll let you just tell the audience who you are and then get an idea as to what you'll be discussing.
So I'll summarize. As you said, I have a very long resume. I'm a software engineer turned policy wonk, specifically for immigration policy, diversity, equity, inclusion, racial justice. But on the side, I've done a lot of activity in politics. Like I volunteered for lots of campaigns, including Barack Obama's campaigns, both of them. I'm an avid traveler. I speak 6 languages. French is my native tongue. And I've been an activist for many years, specifically in my country, which is Canada, specifically about diversity, equity, and inclusion of visible minorities. That led me to work within the system to try to advance these issues on the inside. So I have been on both sides. And I look forward to digging into this subject matter as to whether you can do both.
Yeah, no, that's great. And, before we actually get into the conversation, I want to give a shout out to your charitable work, because this is something that is something that is near and dear to you. So, here's an opportunity to share your experience, doing your work abroad and whatnot. So I like the audience to hear more about that too.
So my parents are immigrants from the Caribbean, and they started helping out from the moment they got off the boat 55 years ago in Montreal. So it's in my family, it's in my blood. But mostly we spent 20 years being a foster family, which means children who are in a difficult family situation. It could be abuse, it could be neglect, need a home, an emergency home. And my parents and I and my sisters were that emergency home for 20 years for about, I want to say about 30 different kids came in and out of our home. Some of them for a weekend, some of them for multiple years. Most of them were Black children. And although technically that's not charity, you do get paid, but that money isn't quite that's not a way to get rich. Let's put it that way. You do it out of love. When you have to get up at 4 a.m. because a kid had nightmares from their life before they came to our home, and you're tired at work the next morning, that little $30 a day doesn't really make up for a disrupted sleep, etc. But it's something that I would love, and I consider myself lucky to have had those children in my life. It really, it crystallizes how much privilege most of us have if you have two parents, if you have a stable home, if you have 3 meals a day. So that's one thing. I have volunteered for other causes like Equal Voice movement in Canada to give women an equal voice in elected offices. I volunteered for the Black Canadian Scholarship Fund. My dad co-founded it with other Black professionals in Ottawa. It's the biggest Black organization in Ottawa that gives out bursaries for Black university-bound students. They give about, I want to say, 4 or 5 bursaries per year. Where do I go? I've also been to Africa, to the continent, where I do this every time I travel to a developing country. You know, you go to the low cost large stores. I don't want to name them. And for $20, you can buy a whole lot of pencils and erasers and mini rulers, where you can call up Oxfam or Red Cross or any NGO that you trust, and say, hey, I'm coming with stuff, match me up with the school. You go to the school, you give all the kids a pencil, and maybe give them a pep talk about staying in school at the same time. I've done that in El Salvador, Benin. I've done that almost everywhere I go, and it feeds my soul personally.
Yeah.
But I also believe in education, and there's nothing like having a real live American, so to speak, come to these places to say, you guys matter. And then sometimes they'll ask questions, and it gives you a reason to chat. I think one of the questions I remember most, it was in rural Benin, and some kid, I'm a software engineer,
Yeah.
and I'm a girl. And some kid, they were maybe 9 years old, 10 years old, they put their hand up at the end of my little soliloquy, and they said, how is it possible that a girl can be an engineer?
Yeah.
And that became a teaching moment, not just for the boys, but the girls in class, that you can do anything, including quote unquote man jobs, and that you can study and become an engineer. You can do something just as well as a boy can. And that message, which is, I think, not as pertinent in North America, it really resonates in some developing countries, in rural areas where there's still those dynamics. So those are some of the charities I've worked with.
Yeah.
I've been on the
No.
board of the Montfort Hospital. It's the biggest French-speaking hospital outside of Quebec in Ontario. I've done a lot of stuff. I believe in giving back. And I also want to say, those of you listening, that volunteering is not just about giving your time and your energy. It's also about learning.
Yeah.
Being on important boards is a great learning experience for how decisions are made, contacts, etc. So I want to say that volunteering, I've given a lot, but it's given me back.
Yeah. And you know, in doing this work in equity and inclusion, belonging, it's about love, it's about learning from your lived experiences and giving back. And that's what I like hearing out of what you've mentioned, and what I hear with other equity practitioners and professionals that do this work. And so was, you know, so it was great to hear that. And it actually just leads us into our conversation about, you know, that activism versus pragmatism within the work that we do. So let's just jump right in for a second. And, you know, what are your thoughts of being an activist and or being a practitioner in this work? Can it actually be realistically possible?
Personally, I would say no. I'd say that being an activist in its purest form means you are free to speak, free to act without any barriers. And the reality is that when you are under the thumb of an employer who maybe claims that they want to advance DEI within their organization, but there are still limits to that. There are still limits to what they're comfortable with. There are limits to what they will allow. And that's where the pragmatism comes along. And you might have to take off your activist hat if you want to keep your job and become a pragmatist. And that's the best case scenario in my opinion, because sometimes, and you hear about this throughout the industry, is that these people are high. In fact, there's an article today in the New York Times about the
Mm,
arts, field of arts, where they hire these people as with a great title, but they give them no tools and no support to enact anything at all. And that person eventually leaves out of frustration, perhaps because they can't even be pragmatic.
yeah,
But can you do both? I've never seen that happen where you can be both and keep your job.
yeah,
That's part of the reason why I got into consulting. I feel like, they pay you because they want to hear some hard truths. They want to get that advice, whether they follow it or not. I still got paid, but I really love the consulting angle that it's given me a freedom, I think, to have those tough conversations and to poke the bear a little bit. And that's where my happy place is.
Yeah, I mean, some of these, as consultants, some of these things that we talk about or that we see in the RFPs out there, some of them are really after that anti-oppression, anti-racist lens, especially with, social service nonprofits, for instance, where it goes on that angle. But if you're going for a private organization or even public sector organization, you don't see that language in their RFPs. It's straight up, it's pragmatist, it's basically doing things by the book, like you said.
Yes.
And it's about the vision and mission of the organization. How do you align your strategy, your EDI or ENI or EIB, whatever you want to call it, your strategy to the organization, and how will that move forward? Can you
Exactly.
do that? Can you do that as an activist? Maybe in a social services organization, but not, and that's why I say, maybe, right?
Mhm.
But in reality, is that you have to move forward from that. And these are the conversations that I kind of have. And it's like, I was in a, for instance, I was in a chat group where you start to see everyone talking about all these terminologies, all the, given the fact that they need to make change and all that. But we've been at that circle for such a long time, is that has any change happened? And so these are the kind of things that start to worry me about equity practitioners. And as to your point, once people get frustrated, they get burnt out, they end up leaving. And we've seen many articles written by academics, by professionals, that burnout is a thing within this profession. And that's
Definitely.
more than likely because of the fact that you haven't changed from being an activist to someone who's a pragmatist who can work with an organization and deliver outcomes for your organization. So, I mean, some people in the audience may not agree with us on this, but this is something that we start to see, right? And they can agree that the burnout is the biggest factor here.
Definitely. I would say one thing. Um, I've heard of professionals policy professionals specifically, that are activists in their heart, and they're not working in a DEI. They're working on something else. But they'll use their position, maybe as a manager or an executive, to just ask questions so that whatever they do has an inkling of an equity lens. So
Mhm.
I'll pick a dumb example. You're the finance person at your large corporation, and you decide which contracts get signed and which ones don't. And for the catering, it's always the same three companies. They're all Caucasian male owned. And you say, wouldn't it be interesting if we diversified our offers for culinary offers for the next
Mhm.
conference? And just by asking the question as a manager or as an executive, forces the people who do make the working level to sort of review what they're doing and think about it, and maybe look for one out of the three who is not from traditional sources. So
Mhm.
that's a way to be an activist. I would say a silent, subtle activist. And I've read and I've heard of people who do it that way without the title of DEI anything. And that's their way of advancing the cause without having the accoutrement of, the system. to deal with. And it could be a small thing, but it can make a difference.
No, exactly. And so as we get into that activist side of things, one of the areas within this work, as you know, as consultants, sometimes they suggest starting up employee resource groups, or the acronym ERGs. And you know, but how can those, you know, as we're talking about meshing with an organization's mission and vision, you know, how can they mesh with them? And also, you know, how, you know, in your experience, if you've been either in an ERG or, you know, seen it from the outside, you know, how can they overcome any challenges that they may face being an activist in these types of organizations, and if they're meant to be activist?
When my friends, family, or people I'm consulting with informally ask me about ERGs, if they're people of color, if they're minorities, if they're LGBT, and they're asked to create one or lead one or join one at work, I tell them, run away. Run away, because there is no clear benefit in your volunteering extra time, extra hours, unpaid, to lead an initiative that's basically a PR exercise for the organization. That's how I would qualify them. I don't know what good there is for minorities to talk to other minorities about how they're treated unfairly. It shouldn't be us talking to us. It's management changing the system so we don't have to experience these things. I think it's a complete sideshow. It's a distraction. And I tell people, don't join them unless there's something in it for you. If the time that you invest is paid and you don't have to deliver everything on time, if it's FaceTime with executives that might help your career, there has to be something in it for you. Because if it's just helping the company cover their behinds, their buttocks, I don't know what use it is except helping them. Now, I have to say, I have been part of several ERGs my whole career that were outside of the organization's reach. They don't even know about them.
Yeah.
And that's the way I like it.
Yeah.
That's the way we can have honest conversation without Big Brother watching. That's what I feel like it is when there's a wraparound by the organization, the institution. Big Brother is watching, and sometimes they're watching for the wrong reasons. So all of my ERGs, or my I don't even call them employees. We just kind of get together and chat and strategize and mentor each other, and sometimes commiserate. Those are not known to the employer. They happen outside of company time, either at lunchtime. We go off site, we talk, because it makes some people nervous if too many of us gather at one time. And we do that, but we definitely don't tell the employer that we're doing that at all. And another risk, is that the employer kind of appropriates that, and then their annual report says, look how diverse we are. We have this group of people who get together and talk. You know, they didn't pay, they didn't give, they didn't contribute, not paying for lunch. Like, no, run away. That's my advice. I don't know that there's a way for ERGs to be useful to minorities.
Yeah, no, and I agree with you on that. And you know, this is a conversation that I had recently, not necessarily attributed to or equivalent to ERGs, but you know, what we're trying to achieve is equity and equitable outcomes for an organization, if we're going to be, whether activists or pragmatists. So, you know, and you go back and, you know, I want to reiterate that point of, you know, what's in it for me, right? And the thing is that if we're doing this at the side of our desks, you know, the whole idea of being paid for this, you know, a lot of organizations feel like this is something that should be part of a volunteer experience. It should be done, you know, on your own time, whether it's during your lunch or after work, or, you know, at the very least, you know, an hour of your time at a meeting. So, you know, at the end of the day, yeah, there is going to be benefit of that. You should be paid for. It's not necessarily, you know, paid as part of your job, But if you're going to take this seriously, this is something that you should really consider as an activity, like you are, say you're on a board of directors, right? You get paid a stipend for that, right? So why wouldn't you do that as a member
Exactly.
of such a group, right? And this is something that, which I'll put in the show notes, is something that Dr. Jonathan Ashton Lamptey talks about in his podcast, um, about the fact that that he differentiated both. And this is the conversation that we're having is, what's the benefit of either or? You've already mentioned there's no benefit in having an ERG unpaid and volunteer. And now we're starting to see, the benefits of being paid and getting an outcome out of it.
Mhm. I also like to add that you and I, and maybe most people listening, live in capitalist nation.
Mhm.
And you can tell what any organization or any government's priorities are based on how much money they invest in it. And the fact that ERGs are by definition volunteer and unpaid really exemplifies how seriously they take it.
Yeah.
And that's another reason why I would never participate. But last reason is that my ancestors already worked for free for 400 years. I don't have to work for free anymore, especially not for a corporation. Like, this makes no sense.
Yeah, no, exactly. This is something that we need to stand up for. And this is not a volunteer activity. This
Yeah.
never should be at the side of our desk. So yeah, I mean, some people believe that's just a quick entry and a quick change point, but it's not, you know what I mean? So let's change the script a little bit here, because, we're talking about activism and pragmatism, but yet now we're starting to see the opposite happening, where, the whole woke movements, if you will, the activist movements that we're starting to see, some people, as they say, they're getting tired of this. Why should we change? That's part of that whole change management theory of, people are resistant to change, or people are tired of no change happening, right? So now we're starting to see this in, excuse me, in with American universities, where they want to change their EDI practices. We're starting, and both in the US and in Europe, we're starting to see people who are rebelling against pronouns. We're starting to see now, even more so for those listeners who haven't heard about the Anheuser-Busch ads that have come out, where a transgendered individual was promoting the beer, and yet you start to see people like, Kid Rock and other people of the like of the, the Donald J. Trump types of people who are who are against this anyway, and shoot beer cans or throw beer down a toilet, or whatever the case may be. So so then it goes to the point here is, has activism reached its course, and has that allowed these activists, if you will, get into the conversation and cause this battle to be against EDI practices, or against equity, etc. So what's your take on all that's been going on over the last, maybe 4 or 5 years, and more so over the last few months?
I would say that when protesters are of color or are minorities, it could be women, LGBT, they are tagged in the past 5 years as woke. What's the word? They have like a woke army or some kind
Yeah.
of like invasionary kind of language.
Mm-hmm.
But when white men coalesce into a movement, it's not labeled as something as negative.
Mm-hmm.
I would argue that the anti-LGBT, anti-trans, usually, not always, but anti-feminist movements are usually led by white men. And they want to cancel our rights. They want to cancel our progress. They want us back in the kitchen barefoot and pregnant. They want gays back in the closet. They want Black people back at the back of the bus. They want to cancel us. And I feel like, one, they don't get the negative label, but two, this has been going on for years and they've never gotten the label. It's normal. and it's accepted, and it's even a debate on some TV and radio stations, as if that's debate, as if our rights are debatable.
Mhm.
And as far as Anheuser-Busch, the beer, what I, you know, I haven't followed every single thing, but I did see one of those artists, maybe it was Kid Rock or somebody that's from the country music world, shooting
Yeah.
at either the beer or the beer image or the image of the trans person, or all three, or
Mhm.
symbolically all three. So using like violence literally just to show their disdain and how strongly they want to cancel this. Um, the fact, I don't think that minorities could ever use that kind of violence and just be swept under the rug or taken not really seriously. You know, they'd be out to get our guns if we did that. But somehow it seems to be okay for them to do that. But bigger picture, I also feel like, I also wonder if Anheuser-Busch kind of predicted this and wanted some controversy, because it seems like their crowd was the middle America, Bible Belt, kind of country music loving, Missouri kind of person. And that's usually a demographic that isn't too amenable to, I mean, they voted for Donald J. Trump by a wide margin. They're usually not that open to diversity or to LGBT or to trans. It felt like they were trying to poke the bear. I can't see how that is an accident. So that's one question. Or are they using that, the culture wars, for lack of a better word, for their own gain? That's the question. And if
Yeah.
so, we're all kind of we're all um, we're all on their chessboard that they're moving. They're playing with our
Yeah.
feelings. That's one. And two, um, I feel like Anheuser-Busch has always been about white people, white women, white men drinking beer. And now it feels like they went diversity, but they kept it white. It's still white people, and I'm
Yeah.
excluded regardless.
Yeah.
So, you know, to me, that it's not really a brand that I've ever identified with, and they're opening diversity to just another white person. To me, is the same. It's the same kind of people I've never associated with myself with them, regardless. And we're still, people of color are still excluded from that brand. And I
Yeah.
think that's a real good. It's a point to make that diversity can still exclude certain people, and it's usually people of color.
Yeah, exactly. And with Anheuser-Busch and Bud and Bud Light, it was mainly Bud Light. I don't drink the beer. To me, it tastes like piss. And so that's, and like you said, it's that same market. So it's just like just twisting that market all together. Um, and the fact of the matter is, they had to go after an influencer to do this, right? What does that show? What does that show people in terms of this work? Are they taking it seriously? It's just, to me, it's just about marketing dollars, right?
Mm.
What gives them, and that's been traditionally the case, and it's not just with Anheuser-Busch, it's with other companies who have fallen flat in their face in doing these diverse ads to attract business. But yet, going back to even the ERGs, it's what are you doing within your organization to promote equity
I'd
and
love to
inclusion?
know that.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly. Right.
How are
So
trans people treated if they work at Anheuser-Busch in the
yeah.
factory or whatever? I'd love to know that. Or how
Mhm.
committed are they to the cause of trans people? Or is it just a marketing ploy to get free publicity for a couple months? That's
Yeah.
another very good question that I don't think anybody's asked. That's another
Yeah.
worry I have, that the media isn't really engaging in the right questions.
Yeah.
Because I hope that at least the LGBT community is asking that question, because that would be my litmus test on whether or not they really actually care about
Yeah.
that, or they're just using us like a pawns on a chessboard, really.
Yeah.
Another thing I want to say about the media is that so the demographic that I referred to before, Bible Belt, Middle America, tends to be not as amenable to the LGBT community.
Mhm.
And we saw that with the reaction to the Anheuser-Busch commercial starring a trans person. And so, but I haven't heard the label of those people are traditionally homophobic
Yeah.
in any of the coverage, where we hear that about African Americans all day long. Well,
Mhm.
oh, it's because they're Black, so of course they're anti-LGBT. And I just find the juxtaposition and um, really the white supremacy of even the coverage of this story there's a lot of blind spots that need to be addressed. But well, I mean, we'll see how it plays out. But I definitely feel like there's white supremacy in the way they created the ad. There's white supremacy in how the media is looking at it. And that's another diversity lens that hasn't been really taken seriously.
Yeah, and it goes into that whole, as we spoke about earlier about, you know, the fact that there's no action within organizations, and then the people who are trying to do this work ends up becoming performative, as we're seeing now, right? It's all about the marketing dollars. So what gives, and how can things change moving forward? What should organizations do, regardless if they're nonprofit or for profit? What should, or even, and for that matter, what should government do to not be performative in this type of work, and allow for all voices, I guess, in this perspective? Or should they even be, from the outset, we talked about pragmatism. I mean, is that the best way to move forward and get outcomes instead of just being an activist?
I'm really focused on outcomes. I'm focused on numbers. I am an engineer, so I love numbers. I love I love math, and
Yeah.
I like measurements that are not they're not open to interpretation,
Mhm.
and they can be measured over time. Uh, the academic term is longitudinal data.
Right.
And so what I think is missing from a lot of these big organizations and governments is that lens towards results and measuring them. And they're very happy being at the start of the arc, which is awareness, armchair discussions, lunch and learn with samosas and Jamaican patties, because that's an easy measure in terms of, look, we had this many people show up at our lunch. We had this
Mhm.
many armchair discussions with this many viewers. And those are all good things, but we're past that now. In fact, we've been
Mhm.
there for, I'd say, 20 years. We're at the spot where we start to count, like, is this working? Are people getting hired, promoted, retained? Um, inclusion when they come into the office, are they included, or do they feel welcomed? Are they experiencing microaggressions all day long? Like, I want to measure that, and that's how you're doing it right, or you need to step it up, or where the gaps are. And
Mhm.
until we get to that conversation, I feel like we're just circling the wagons. And
Yeah.
too many organizations are happy to do this performative stuff that really costs very little and has effect that you can't really measure. So we'll know that we're making progress when we're having those conversations about measuring outcomes, just like they measure for anything else that organizations do. You don't just say, "Hey, we spent some money. We don't know if it actually got the results." We want to know what we spent and how much dollars went to each part, and whether or not those had the expected outcomes. And that has to be happen. That has to happen for DEI to be worth it. And if I'm a DEI practitioner who is hired and an employee of these organizations, it's important for you as a practitioner coming in to have realistic expectations. Hopefully you ask the right questions ahead of time. How big is the staff? Do I have an administrative assistant? Do I have a budget? What are the outcomes expected to be measured every year? And really be aware of where you're going, and be aware that your shelf life might be limited. Whether it's limited because the organization isn't ready to do anything, or it's limited because you have to protect yourself, because the emotional labor that you do every day regardless of salary, it does get draining. And so as a practitioner, I would ask the right questions at the outset, but I would also prepare myself for the next step or the next job, so that when I am emotionally drained, and it's not if, it's when,
Mhm.
that you have something to go to that will, hopefully make you whole again, because it is exhausting. And organizations, most of them are not ready for everything. And being a pragmatic person may get you some results, but it also gets you some ire, usually from minority communities
Yeah.
who have expectations. That's another thing that's never written on the job description as a DEI practitioner, is that, yeah, the organization has goals and ideals, but there's also a huge community, both inside and outside, who's looking, who's watching, who's
Mhm.
expecting, who hopes. And when they don't see the results that they'd like to see, or activists on the outside call you out because you couldn't deliver, because it just wasn't possible pragmatically,
Mhm.
that's another thing that weighs on DI practitioners. And so knowing all that, you go in, you do your best, you last a year or two, and then you prepare to segue to somebody else, or pass the baton like the Jamaican relay team to somebody else, because it's hard to take that on long term and stay sane.
Yeah, no, I hear you. There's, I feel like you've summarized probably 3 or 4 previous webcasts that I've had, where, my last one was about data equity. I had one with a friend of ours, Chris Scipio,
Yes.
where we spoke about performative attitudes within an organization. How do we move towards equity? Like, and I'll put those in our show notes as well. And these are things that, equity practitioners need to be aware of going in, because a lot of times, and I think it, including from post George Floyd, was everyone was an activist,
Yes.
right? And so once they found out, now we're starting to see the burnout, the psychological ramifications from that, and people leaving the organization, people leaving, and then of course it goes to some organizations now in the cloak of the recession that we are in now, is those programs are being eliminated.
Yes.
So,
Warner Brothers.
exactly, Warner
That's
Brothers,
the first
perfect
thing they
example.
killed.
Exactly, right. And we're starting to see it with other organizations, where the majority of their workforce are people from marginalized and racialized backgrounds, such as Amazon, perfect example, right? And then you start to see all the job cuts there, and of course their IT staff. Majority of them are from South Asian communities.
Yes.
What happens there, right? So at the end of the day, has your activism worked, right?
Mm-hmm.
And now that these organizations, first of all, the organizations fully understand that, but second of all, have activists now learned that, as they continue to say, do you, and even in the world that we've worked in and work in, is government, is you have to play the game, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that, I guess, in a roundabout way, that's the pragmatism that you have to be, or be the pragmatist that you have to be, right? So, so we're going, are there any last words before we close this off?
Well, I think you're going to ask me about where we go from here, follow thoughts.
Yeah.
I want to say, demographically, economically, and politically, DI matters.
Mhm.
Minorities are a sleeping giant, really. It's inevitable, like rain and tax. That's a shout out to Celine Dion song. It's, we're going to be, in some cases, a majority group in many countries, including the United States and Canada, and possibly I think London is already there, right?
Yeah,
Or close
I think
to
so.
it.
Close to it, yeah.
And so organizations, governments will either embrace DI genuinely, or face the consequences. Those that are being pulled kicking and screaming towards equity, the consequences could be dire in terms of tuning in, purchase. Some of them are going to be canceled because we've checked out. And if you clung to white supremacy too long, it could have dire consequences for the ballot box, for some businesses that obviously are not getting our dollars because, or even I'd say public broadcasters that we stopped watching collectively because they just don't represent, they're out of touch.
Yeah.
So, I mean, my popcorn is ready. And so is my voting record, and so are my consumer dollars. So I'm ready to pick the winners and to tilt the scale collectively as a triple minority, and buyer beware, basically.
Mm-hmm. And that's why I moved to saying now, since the conversation is moving from minority or visible minority to majority, global majority, because of this switch in demographics in North America and in parts of Europe, and given the fact that now India is going to bypass China in terms of population growth, or total population, if you will, what is that going to say about our global, our global footprint? I wouldn't say footprint because that's more climate change, but our, the global atmosphere, if you will, in terms of, where we need to go from here, where organizations need to go from here, and how globalization takes into effect in terms of who we hire, where our marketing goes to, and does it match with your organization as a whole. And
exactly.
And that's why activists need to, at least to us, need to understand that you can't really go into an organization thinking you're going to make change because you're just only one voice, right? You're battling, like you said at the beginning, within our conversation, of activists not only need to who need to think about the organization, but also within their own communities that they're trying to help, because there's going to be differences of opinion, difference of thoughts, difference of cultures, etc., that you have to work with. And it's important to understand such things as cultural intelligence, right? These are things that we need to be at these new or even existing equity practitioners should be able to understand. So
exactly.
And
wanted
actually
to say one last
go
thing.
ahead. One last thing, go ahead. And I was actually, before you go to your one last thing, I'm surprised you didn't mention any quotes from Whitney Houston. So anyway.
Next time. I do believe the children are our future if you teach
there you
them
go.
well
See?
and
There
let them lead the way. But I want to say that I'm going to put my activist hat on, the Angela Davis hat on, and say that for North America, this increase in minorities as a percentage of the population, it's actually, to me, just a reset of what it was originally. Because originally, the Americas were 100% minority. And European people had 500 years, and now it's going to go back to a majority again. But it's a regression of what it was originally. It's not like we're taking over. That's how I see it, and I find it very telling when the media portrays it as we're taking over, as opposed to it's going back to its original configuration.
Exactly. So
Miigwech.
that's right. As we're talking about Indigenous people, the original people of North America and South America, if you will, and the Caribbean, if you will.
Exactly.
So with that, I thank you, Rachel, for this excellent conversation. So, where can everyone find you on the, in the social media world?
You can find me on Twitter at Rachel_Decoste. You can find me on my website, racheldecoste.ca or .com, RACHELDECOSTE. And I would love to hear from you. I do DI in both official languages, en français, en anglais. My Spanish is not good enough to have a whole conversation or whole training, but I would love to hear from you if you have opinions on what we said, even if they're deferring and dissenting opinions. I would love to hear what you have to say.
That is great to hear. And thank you very much, Rachel, for your excellent commentary. It's always nice to hear from you, and your audience is privileged to hear what you have to say on this topic, and look forward to having future conversations with you.
Thank you, Andre.
Thanks. And that closes another episode of Global Conversations. Make sure to subscribe on the YouTube page at youtube.com at 416 Urban Equity. So with that, I bid you adieu, and until next time.